Well, Bob Woodward has done it again. He has written another book that goes deep inside another presidency. And as usual, portions of the book appeared in the Washington Post first. They appeared today, a week before the book will actually be published. Bob Woodward has spent his career at the Washington Post and has written books about the inside workings of every presidency, beginning with the Nixon White House. Bob Woodward quotes White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, calling the president an idiot. He quotes Defense Secretary James Mattis, comparing Donald Trump's comprehension level to, quote, a fifth or sixth grader. He quotes James Mattis telling the president that he's trying to, quote, prevent World War III. He quotes Donald Trump, calling his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, quote, mentally retarded. And he quotes the president's former criminal defense lawyer, John Dowd, telling the president that if the president testifies under oath in the Mueller investigation, the president will end up in, quote, an orange jumpsuit. The lawyer told the president, quote, you are not a good witness. And so tonight, the Trump White House has made the mistake of going to war with Bob Woodward, a war they cannot win because they don't know how Bob Woodward does it. And that means they don't know what they're up against. The White House press secretary issued a written statement saying, quote, this book is nothing more than fabricated stories. John Kelly issued a written statement denying that he called the president an idiot. Defense Secretary James Mattis issued a written statement saying the contemptuous words about the president attributed to me in Woodward's book were never uttered by me or in my presence. That appears to be a reference to the description of Trump as a fifth grader, but James Mattis does not seem to dispute any of the other many quotes attributed to him in the book, including his statement to the president about he, the defense secretary, trying to prevent World War III. The Trump White House has no idea what they're dealing with when it comes to a Bob Woodward book. And they obviously had no idea what they were dealing with when Bob Woodward was pulling all of that information out of the Trump White House for his book. Bob Woodward described some of his method directly to the president when Donald Trump called him to talk about the book after the book was already being printed, and it was too late for Bob Woodward to interview Donald Trump for the book. Because Bob Woodward is the consummate professional, he immediately began recording the phone call with the president, and he told the president that he was recording the call. The president pretended that he was disappointed that he didn't get to do an interview with Bob Woodward for the book. Bob Woodward explained that he asked more than half a dozen people in the White House for that interview, people who said they passed the request on to the president, and people outside the White House, including Senator Lindsey Graham. Bob Woodward released today a recording of that entire phone call with the president. Here's some of it.
Senator Graham said he had talked to you about talking to me. Now, is that not true?
Senator Graham actually mentioned it quickly on one meeting, and
we'll see,
you know that is true. That is true. Well, but that is true. Mentioned it quickly, not like you know. And I would certainly have thought that maybe you would have called the office, but that's okay. I'll speak to Kellyanne. I am a little surprised that she wouldn't have told me.
Yeah,
in fact, she just walked in. I'm talking to Bob Woodward. He said that he told you about speaking to me, but you never told me. Why didn't you tell me? I would have been very happy to speak to him. All right, so what are you going to do?
Well,
so I have another bad book coming out.
It goes on, and you know, what you can count on is that I've been very careful. And Evelyn, are you on?
Yes.
Evelyn Duffy, who's my assistant, Mr.
Hello, Evelyn.
She transcribed all the tapes because, with permission, I tape people for hundreds of hours.
Good.
And I think there's nothing in this book that doesn't come from a first-hand source. Is that correct, Evelyn?
I believe. But are you naming names, or do you just say sources?
Yeah, well, it names real incidents. So
no, but do you name sources? I mean, are you naming the people, or just say, you know, people have said?
I say at 2 o'clock on this day, the following happened, and everyone who's there, including yourself, it is quoted. And I'm sorry I didn't get to ask you about these.
I mean, you do know I'm doing a great job for the country.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure he knows that. He's got tapes. That's what the Trump White House did not really understand until today, if they understand it even now. And Bob Woodward played one of those tapes publicly today, that phone call with the president, to try to show the White House what he has. And then he told the president in that phone call, I taped people for hundreds of hours. And so now, tonight, Donald Trump knows that Bob Woodward taped members of the Trump team for hundreds of hours. No one works harder at trying to find out what has happened inside the room in Washington than Bob Woodward. And no one has more sources than Bob Woodward. When Bob Woodward was working on a book about the Clinton White House called The Agenda, he came to me because so much of the Clinton White House agenda had to pass through the Senate Finance Committee, where I was the chief of staff. And I will never forget Bob Woodward's first question to me, with no small talk, no beating around the bush. He wanted to know about what happened in a meeting with President Clinton and congressional leaders in the cabinet room at the White House. And so his very first question to me was, everyone in the cabinet room meeting says that you were taking notes. Can I have your notes? In those days, there were plenty of reporters who were trying to get me to tell them what happened in meetings in the White House, in the Senate Majority Leader's office, in the Speaker's office, but no one ever asked if he or she could have my notes. Bob Woodward always goes for the best possible sources, and notes are always better than human memory. Many years later, when I was no longer working in government, I visited Bob Woodward's home a few times, where much of the space is devoted to his office, where his assistants are constantly transcribing audio recordings. He gave me a tour of the workshop, a place where you can see decades and decades of archived audio recordings, recordings that are the building blocks of the investigative journalism that has so often become the defining version of a presidency, the Woodward version. What Bob Woodward calls the best obtainable version of the truth. And so tonight, Bob Woodward has tapes, and the White House has press releases. The most damning quotes in the excerpts of Bob Woodward's book that were already released today are from the president's former criminal defense lawyer, John Dowd. Bob Woodward describes a rehearsal session with the president where John Dowd pretended to be Robert Mueller, asking the president questions. The Washington Post reports that in that rehearsal session, Donald Trump's answers were, quote, stumbles, contradictions, and lies, until the president eventually lost his cool. This thing's a goddamn hoax. Trump erupted at the start of a 30-minute rant that finished with him saying, I don't really want to testify. The book then describes a meeting John Dowd had with Robert Mueller and Mueller's deputy, James Quarles, in which Dowd explained why he didn't want the president to testify. I'm not going to sit there and let him look like an idiot and you publish that transcript, because everything leaks in Washington and the guys overseas are going to say, I told you he was an idiot. I told you he was a goddamn dumbbell. What are we dealing with this idiot for? After that meeting with Robert Mueller, John Dowd gave the president the following advice, quote, don't testify. It's either that or an orange jumpsuit. The president then said, I'll be a real good witness. You are not a good witness, Dowd replied. Mr. President, I'm afraid I just can't help you. And the next morning, John Dowd quit, and he left an opening on the Trump's defense team that has since been filled by Rudy Giuliani. Leading off our discussion now, John Heilemann, national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's also co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. Tim O'Brien's with us. He's the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. He's the author of Trump Nation, a book about Donald Trump, and an MSNBC contributor. And David Frum, a senior editor for The Atlantic, is the author of Trumpocracy. John Heilemann, you've done this kind of work that Bob Woodward has done. You've done it on the campaign trail, most famously and most widely read, Game Change and other books. Your assessment of how this battle is going so far as we come to the end of day one of the Trump White House versus Bob Woodward?
Well, about how you would expect it to go, which is to say very well for Bob Woodward and very poorly for the White House. The White House has been lucky in some sense in its enemies, although everything that we've read so far from the Woodward book, at least the excerpts and the reporting on it, is very consistent with what we saw in Michael Wolff's book. Mm-hmm. It is the reality that whatever you think of Fire and Fury, Michael Wolff is more easily attacked messenger than Bob Woodward is. Just again, without even being mean to Michael Wolff, although there are issues with Michael Wolff, Bob Woodward is the gold standard, right? And I think that there's
and Bob Woodward has been in this crossfire before many times
before. And look, he's got. Again, you said I'm familiar with that. I am, and there's a very high premium if you're going to do a book on deep background where you're going to say I'm going to quote verbatim from meetings, from notes, from people's recollections. The pressure it puts on the reporter is that you are never going to be able to do what Donald Trump is trying to play the game with Bob Woodward about. Who told you that? Woodward has said to these people he will never say, I got this directly from Jim Mattis. I got this directly from John Kelly. The likelihood is he's spoken to all of them, every single one of them, but Donald Trump, on multiple occasions. But he will never come out. And the reality is, in many of these situations, he's going to have that same quote. Knowing how Bob works, he's going to have it from the speaker, from the person who heard it, from the person the people that were, or other people in the room, other people they told about it, and memorialized perhaps in emails and notes of the conversation. So he's never going to say who the source is, but because of the fact that Woodward's been doing this for so long, and because so many of his books has withstood the kind of criticism that come in all administrations of deep background books, because his books have held up so well to scrutiny over so long, he's in a position of extraordinary power. And although there are now White House officials who are coming out and saying, I didn't use this word, I didn't use that word. What they're not doing is they're not quibbling with the gist of the reporting. And in many cases, some of the people who are quibbling with the specific words are proven liars in the past. And so, again, Bob Woodward, not a proven liar, quite the opposite.
Here's the president's latest lob in the battle tonight. He's tweeted, the Woodward book has already been refuted and discredited by General Secretary of Defense James Mattis and General Chief of Staff John Kelly. Their quotes were made-up frauds, a con on the public. Likewise, other stories and quotes. Woodward is a Dem operative, ? Notice timing, ? Tim O'Brien, the various White Houses have accused at different times Bob Woodward of being of the opposite party whenever these books come out.
Right, and it's interesting that Trump even now cannot help himself but give free publicity that's going to boost sales to this very critical book, just like he did to Omarosa and just like he did to Michael Wolff, because he personalizes all of these, and he can't, in the midst of it, he can't think strategically. And anybody who's covered Trump knows that the full picture of what Woodward is presenting is not only consistent with all the reporting that's been out there for the last 2.5 years since Trump began running, it's consistent with who Donald Trump has been since he was about 7 years old. He ran the Trump Organization this way. It was a bunch of people biting each other in the back, not loyal to him ultimately, and he ran roughshod over all of them. He ran his political campaign when he ran for the presidency exactly the same way. You were in the midst of that, John. You know what that was about. And the picture that's created here is amply solidified and backed up by lots of other reporting, with the additional factor that now you have Bob Woodward and the Woodward method, which is he triangulates with sources. He backs things up with documents. He has tapes. It's a different order of magnitude from any kind of reporter that Trump has ever dealt with before, in the same way that the Mueller investigation is of a different order of magnitude on the legal side.
Well, let me just stay on this for a second, because you were a different kind of reporter than Trump had ever dealt with before when he dealt with you. And he ended up in court with you because he was stunned that you were the one who he could not con on the question of how rich he was. So you won the lawsuit against him.
And I had tapes.
And you had tapes of the depositions and so forth. But talk about Trump when he's up against something he doesn't understand, because you experienced that with your own book about Trump and his business.
Well, the tricky thing here is that he is constantly up against things that he doesn't understand, because he's impatient, he's ignorant, and he has no real sense that he's vulnerable to anything. He's been protected his whole life, first by wealth, then by celebrity, and now by the presidency. And he's never really suffered the consequences of his phenomenally bad decision-making until he actually stares him in the face. It clicked with him a couple months ago that Don Jr. might suddenly be vulnerable in the Mueller investigation. In our case, I don't think he ever thought the New York Times or my publisher would retain attorneys to back me up. He then never thought they would get him for 2 days for 2 8-hour depositions in which we put his own tax returns and his own bank records and business records in front of him. And he was found on dozens of occasions to have lied, and that went into the record. And he essentially created a Rosetta Stone for understanding the kind of pathology and the world that Trump exists in. So one of the reasons he gets into these situations is because of who he is. One of the reasons he survives them is because of who he is. And in that tape, that conversation with him and Woodward, he's very blasé about the fact that he's trying to lie his way out of never knowing that Bob Woodward tried to interview him. But there's no real fear in it. He's playing ping pong.
Yeah, and David Frum, that's one of the great things about the tape that Bob Woodward released today is that there's a tape of Donald Trump, and everything about it is false. I mean, it's just quite obvious, and people should go online and listen to the whole thing, where he's telling a recurring lie throughout the whole thing, which is that no one told him about this interview request, and then Bob Woodward presses him just on Lindsey Graham, and he goes, oh, yeah, well, okay, Lindsey Graham told him. Yeah. And it's kind of a look into the way Trump operates with every lie he can get away with, he will try.
It is a really important tape to listen to because what you also hear is as he is nailed on the lie by Woodward, very elegantly and politely, the president becomes, at the beginning he's relatively suave by his standards. He becomes angrier and then ultimately incredibly self-pitying. Meanwhile, he summons in Kellyanne Conway, and who's caught in a lie too, and again, nailed elegantly and politely. And she has a very different method. First she tries to brazen it out, then she throws other people under the bus, then she finally desperately changes the subject. The thing I find myself thinking about a lot as I review these first stories from the book, and of course we'll all want to read the finished product, I understand, as I think about it, the James Mattises and the General Kellys, they're staying to serve the country. And I understand why they feel they need to protect their position. To me, and Donald Trump is what he is, and Bob Woodward is, of course, the elegant and eminent figure that he is. I'm puzzled by the Gary Cohns, the H.R. McMasters, the Rex Tillersons, the people who obviously talk to Woodward, who obviously have unburdened themselves of their sense of the extreme, not only unfitness, but danger to the country by this president. I wonder, are you going to do anything more than talk to a reporter months after the fact? Why didn't you resign together? Why didn't you do on the day you left? Gary Cohn, you are telling me that the president cannot remember that if you take a piece of paper off his desk, that it was there? 2 hours later, he forgets the paper was ever there and that he intended, a catastrophically bad policy, but it was his policy and he can't remember it? Why didn't you share that with the committee of Congress at a time when it was relevant? Why now and why anonymously? I understand it's hazardous, but a lot of Americans have had over the centuries to take a lot of risks to defend the country. It's not so much to risk getting an angry negative tweet from this president compared to what other people have done in order to defend your country.
And David, one of the phenomena we're seeing just in these excerpts, and again, you're right, we're going to have to see the whole book to really analyze this, but it does seem like that the people who are swimming away from this Titanic that is the Trump White House, or rowing away in their lifeboats, however you want to put it, are very eager to tell Bob Woodward extremely negative stuff about the president, which means it seems like they're very eager to try to claim a space in the sane world as fast as they can. Reince Priebus and, as you say, Gary Cohn and others who appear to be sources for this book.
Yeah. Well, look, I think many of them are obviously capable people, and some of them are probably morally fine people. I have a lot of respect for people like Gary Cohn and Rex Tillerson, too. But own it. Stand up. Don't be anonymous. And don't wait. Don't give it to Bob Woodward. We're glad to have it in any way it comes, but why not at the time? One of the questions presented by this book is, should you serve this president? And for people who are doing it for the right reasons and who are in national security roles, I commend them and thank them for serving the president. But if you are going to leave, or if you're forced out, make your resignation count. Do it in a group. Do it on the same day, and then immediately spell out in detail why you're doing it.
David Frum, Tim O'Brien, John Heilemann, thank you for starting us off tonight.